We're going to be doing some cutting demonstrations today to really give you an idea of how maybe better or differently to use beef in the classroom. And I know with high school culinary programs, one of the limiting factors is budget and money, especially when it comes to beef, as it is the most expensive protein and by quite a bit. So today we're going to be breaking down subprimals, and this is a great way to stretch your dollar further. This guy is $91 in total. This is a chuck roll, and this is one of the subprimals that I'm most interested in showing you because you can do so many different things with it. So it's not just one day of beef for your classroom, it really can be multiple. The chuck roll is from, if you imagine what's underneath your shoulder blade, that's where it is on the animal, between the shoulder blade and the spine of the animal. So most of it is support muscles, which support muscles just hold the animal together and really aid it in movement, but it doesn't move the animal. And that's really important because support muscles are generally more tender and more flavorful than locomotion muscles. If you think of round steaks or London broil steaks, a lot of times are pretty tough and not very flavorful. So this is from the chuck. The chuck is also thought of as one of the fattest cuts of beef, and you'll see as we get going in here that there's quite a bit of fat in between the muscles. That's called seam fat, and seam fat is what we want to kind of trim out generally. But the good thing about the chuck is that there's also a lot of fat within the muscle, and that's marbling, and that's what's going to add all of your flavor and juiciness to the beef. One thing I do want to point out before I open the bag and meat is about 72% water. And when we put that in a vacuum packaged bag, we're going to lose a little bit of it. What makes it red is the same pigment that makes meat red. There's a pigment called myoglobin that makes meat red, and that's just leaking out with the water. Another thing I'd like to point out while this is still in a vacuum packaged bag is the color of the beef. This is the color of beef when it is vacuum packaged, when it doesn't have exposure to air. So this is actually the same color if you were to cut steaks out of a big roast. Same color that would be on the inside of the roast before it's exposed to oxygen. When I open up this bag, it should turn red within about 10 to 15 minutes. And that's just that pigment getting exposed to oxygen. So we'll watch it bloom here on the table for us. Once we get it open. Okay, so think about that as we're doing the rest of the cutting demonstration. It's kind of one of my fun tricks that I like to point out to people. The chuck roll, just orient yourself with this chuck roll. This is where the spine of the animal would be, right here. This is where it has been taken off. The head of the animal would be this direction, and the rib would be on this direction. So ribeye steaks, right here, okay? Head of the animal. The scapula or the blade bone of the animal was taken off right here. So remember when I said it lays between the blade bone of the animal and the backbone? It literally is just the piece of meat that's between the two of them. This area sometimes can have some remnants of the scapula. This is some what we call bone skin. So it's just really heavy connective tissue that was on the blade bone of the animal. And when we took the blade bone off, some of it got left on. Connective tissue is a really ugly word for meat scientists and for your consumers and for chefs. So think of connective tissue as being a barrier to quality. Connective tissue doesn't break down very well. If you do try to break down connective tissue, it's going to take a really long time, moist heat cooking methods. But really, anytime we can take some of this off, we should. So I'm just going to get underneath it with my knife and pull it off, leaving as much meat as possible, just taking the connective tissue. And that's fixed. There's usually a little bit extra on this side as well, right where the chine bones or the vertebra have been taken off, so I'm going to take that off too. This one's not nearly as thick. This connective tissue isn't nearly as thick. But if it's exposed, I might as well remove it so that I can give the customer the best eating experience possible. All right. So remember when I said that this part comes right, ribeye steaks come right off here? The same 3 muscles that are actually within a ribeye steak still continue into the chuck and all the way up to the neck of the animal. This one, and this one. And that's what we're going to call our chuck eye roll. And this chuck eye roll presents a lot of opportunity for us when we start cutting it because, like I said, ribeye steaks are just a saw cut away from this chuck eye. So we can get a few steaks out of here if we pull it off, locate my 3 muscles, and then just start pulling. I expose a fat seam in here. And this fat seam, if I pull and cut, really can come apart pretty well. Previously, or even now in the grocery store, when we go into the grocery store and buy chuck roasts, this is what would make those chuck roasts generally. So rather than just cutting big pieces off of this, we're actually going to dissect it down and give ourselves a little bit more versatility with the cuts that we get from it. Okay. So this is the chuck eye roll. The rest of this that I'm going to put aside here is actually called the underblade because the blade bone sits right here and it's kind of underneath it. But we'll get back to this in a second. So chuck eye roll, like I said, same 3 muscles as a ribeye steak. So why not make us some high quality steaks? These are called chuck eye steaks. And generally you can only get about 2 or 3 of these steaks off of the chuck roll before we start running into some quality issues just from a tenderness standpoint. But if you look at these, how do they look? Pretty darn good, right? Great for grilling. So in the meat industry, we always joke and call these the poor man's ribeye steak. I know in college these were my favorite things to find in retail because they're sold for a fraction of the price of ribeye steaks, but still give the same great eating experience as ribeye steaks. So I'm actually going to get 3 off of this guy, 3 1-inch chuck eye steaks. Great for grilling, a good mimicker of a high quality steak. So that's the first cut we're going to get off of this guy. The next cut is what I'm going to call country style ribs. And I'm sure you all have heard of pork country style ribs, right? Well, this is kind of beef's answer to that. It's a boneless product. We cut a 1-inch chuck steak and then we're going to cut them in half. So then when we cut them in half, they're nice little braisable ribs. We do recommend longer, slower cooking times for these just because if we're going to get a rib texture or a rib flavor, generally those are cooked to a more well-done degree of doneness. So something like throw them in barbecue sauce or braise them or make your own sauce for these is really great. We have also wrapped them in a foil packet and set them on a hot grill for 30 to 45 minutes and just kind of let them steam in their own juices for a while, and those turn out really great as well. If we take them out of the foil packet, grill mark them after they've had a little bit of time on there. Adds grilled flavor, but you still get the fully cooked texture of a rib. So we could cut this entire thing into country style ribs, or we can cut the chuck eye steaks and then country style ribs. So one thing that I'll stress with these, if we're going to cut our own, which is a pretty economically feasible method, there's a lot of versatility. So if we wanted to do all country style ribs one day, we could cut the entire thing into that. Chuck eye steaks are really the only ones that are kind of limited. So these chuck eye steaks, I always say we can only get about 2 or 3 of these because as we move towards the head of the animal, these muscles really are responsible for moving the head back and forth. So then they change from a support muscle to a locomotion muscle. So there's more connective tissue once we get towards the head of this chuck eye roll, less of that inherent quality and tenderness. One other thing we can do with this is make what I like to call, and what the National Cattlemen's Beef Association calls, America's beef roast. It's a kind of chuck roast alternative, but I even like to call it maybe a standing rib roast alternative. Obviously there's no ribs on this guy, but same muscles, much lower dollar value. Looks pretty great on a carving station if we roast it up and then carve little slices off of it. So lots of versatility with this guy. As we get really into this last 3 to 4 inches of the chuck eye roll, there are some connective tissue problems. So if I were going to use this in a classroom setting, I would have my steaks, country style ribs, depending on whether or not I wanted to roast this dry heat cooking method. I could do that. But this I would throw in a crock pot for like some sort of shredded beef item. This really has quite a bit of tenderness challenges just because of, like I said, how much it moves the animal's head back and forth. There's quite a bit of connective tissue in here, but it's still an awesome cut, and it would be slow cooked very, very easily. So, okay. Getting to this underblade, this is one of my favorite parts because can you imagine how that muscle tastes? If you can't see it, it's very heavily marbled. One of the most tender cuts in the whole beef carcass, 4th most tender cut in the beef carcass is this muscle here, but I think it's the one that has the greatest amount of marbling just inherently. It's the same muscle used to make short ribs. So short ribs would come right off of here, be cut right off of here. So if you've ever had a braised short rib, you know how rich and flavorful that muscle is. And so this is a good opportunity to have a kind of a separate lower dollar short rib alternative, I suppose. But before we get all the way down to that, there's actually one on top of here that we have to get off of first. And this cut has been nicknamed the chuck flank. I call it the Sierra cut in my day-to-day life. That's what we call it at National Cattlemen's, is Sierra cut, but it is labeled the chuck flank because it looks and eats very, very similar to a flank steak. It really just falls right in between that chuck eye roll and the large muscle that I was talking about that acts similar to short ribs. And if we just find the seam in between it and that bottom muscle, we can just pull it off. This is actually, fun fact about this muscle. So if you ever see bulls with humps, this is the muscle that gives most of that hump to the bull. It's the muscle that is most influenced by testosterone in the animal. So in bulls and steers, they're larger, and in heifers, which are female animals, they're smaller. So they're a little bit variable from animal to animal and from chuck roll to chuck roll. This one's actually a pretty large one. So my guess is that this would be a steer, which is a castrated male animal. But if I clean it up just a little bit, I would want to remove all of this fat and connective tissue off of the outside, or as much of it as possible. I would keep going on this guy and remove it all the way down, but I just wanted to show a little piece of it because it has those long vertical muscle fibers, fairly lean. It does actually qualify for USDA guidelines for lean, so it's a lean cut. Long vertical muscle fibers. We would need to marinate this though. It's not the most tender muscle in the beef carcass, but we marinate flank steak anyway generally. So generally this would be cleaned up of all this fat and connective tissue so that the marinade can really soak into the beef and act on its muscle fibers. And then we would cook it however you prefer, and then slice very thinly across that grain to enhance tenderness. So this is the chuck flank, very useful. And this one's pretty big, so just know that it might not always be this big. So now I have one left, or two left, I suppose. This one that's hanging on, is the rhomboideus muscle. And the rhomboideus muscle is, I would compare its texture and flavor to being similar to brisket. And so I just cut this in half just to show you the muscle fiber structure and how much marbling it has. It's not the heaviest marbled cut in the whole beef carcass. It's not the most tender. It actually is relatively tough. This can be used for stew meat. So if we cut it and used it for stew meat, it's very good for stew meat. Or if you have a smoker or some way to long, slow braise it for shredded beef, it also works very good for that. I always tell people in my cutting demonstrations, not for grilling, but braised. We've smoked them. They're very good smoked, so we treat them like a brisket, and they come out very good, but not for grilling. So that's that guy. And then we're down to one. And this muscle, if you notice, actually has kind of a fan structure to it. So that's going to present some challenges for some of the industry because we can't necessarily cut all the same size steaks out of this guy. But for you guys, I see it as an opportunity. So if we're gonna make this the best it can be, all of this fat and connective tissue is going to have to go. This shiny silver is silver skin and connective tissue, and that's just a barrier to quality. So the more of that we can take off, the better this cut is going to taste and perform for consumers. And every one of these little lobes has its own sheath of that connective tissue over the top of it. So I'm just going to run my knife underneath it. Do my best to leave as much of that meat on as possible. This is the muscle that I say goes into chuck short ribs, short ribs. It's a very large muscle in the animal, but we only get a fraction of it here in our chuck roll. So there's a little bit of it there that I cut off. I generally just like to square it at some point so that I have a starting place. Depending on cooking method and how we're using it, fat is either going to impart flavor or it's not. So if I were gonna roast this thing whole or smoke it, I might have left that fat on and cooked it fat side up so that when I roast it or smoke it, all of that fat kind of melts and drips into the meat. What I'm going to show you here is steaks and stir fry, and those are really fast cooking methods, right? So those fast cooking methods don't generally lend themselves well to this exterior fat. This exterior fat at that point would just be waste product. It's not imparting any flavor, it's just a waste in your pan or on your grill. Moderation is key in all nutritional messages, and this, if it's not giving us flavor, we can just throw it out. The one thing that does give us flavor is this marbling. So I'm going to face this just so that you can see how much is in here. Can you see how marbled that is? Yeah. All of these specks of fat within the muscle are what really, really give the meat the flavor. So, like I said, if I was going to roast this whole or something like that, I could leave that on so that it kind of self-bastes itself and keeps itself moist, but since I'm going to do some other stuff, that's probably not our best use for it. Okay, so this muscle, like I said, fan-shaped. I'm going to cut steaks out of it first. And in order to cut steaks across the muscle fiber grain, I have to first identify the muscle fiber grain, and it's kind of hard. It goes like this. But I can cut this in half. That's the joy of cutting your own meat, is that you can really do anything possible to yield the best eating experience for consumers and for yourself. So I have one side of it here and one side of it here, and now I can pretty easily turn it and cut it directly across the grain. This muscle, like I said, is very easily mimics short ribs. So long, slow cooking methods or dry heat, quick cooking methods work really well for it. These are what we call Denver steaks, And Denver steaks, I would generally just throw on the grill. They have excellent, excellent buttery beef flavor, very moist. Every once in a while they get a little bit bouncy, and I know that's not really a scientific term for meat and texture, but if you ever get the chance to cook them up, I think that you'll see what I mean. The muscle fibers themselves are very tender, but then you chew it for a few seconds and then all of a sudden it's a little bit bouncy. It's not tough, it doesn't stay in your mouth forever, but it's just a little bit of a challenge with those. So something that we've noticed and that we're working through with retailers and food service operators that are interested in this cut. I would probably prefer to take this, maybe trim off this edge, braise it like a short rib. Excellent buttery, very, very rich beef flavor. It's absolutely delicious, same muscle. Another thing that we do with these, and something that I would suggest, is cutting little stir-fry pieces out of it. This muscle is extremely popular in Asian markets. They're all about beef quality. They're all about that marbling. If you think back to Wagyu and Kobe beef, it's our highest quality beef, and that was originally from Japan. And they love this cut for what they call shabu shabu or hot pot. So very, very well marbled piece of beef. Excellent in stir-fry dishes and things like that. You can make any size pieces out of this that you want. This side that I showed you Denver steaks out of in our little slices is the higher quality side of the two. This one tends to have challenges just because its shape is a little bit funky. This portion is very, very thin, while this portion is that really thick. So depending on what you want to do with this or how you want to use it, you can decide whether or not to keep cutting it into steaks, use it as a roast, use it as a short rib alternative. They're great for short rib alternatives still. It still has all of the same quality attributes, so it's still tender, it's still very rich in flavor. It's just the size that kind of hurts it a little bit. I always kind of cut off this really thin piece. It would be great like stew meat, even kebabs if you make kebabs. Great stew meat or kebabs, and then I can keep cutting this guy into steaks across the grain if I wanted to, but they are a little bit different in size and shape, but not too bad. So depending on how you want to use it and how you want to cut it, that's a really good alternative as well, or just keep it whole and roast or braise for short rib alternative. So what I'd like to stress is that by just buying one piece of meat, we now have multiple cooking method opportunities. We have multiple beef opportunities, whereas if we went to a grocery store and bought stew meat or even steaks of some sort or a roast, we probably would pay just as much for this guy and have less meat.